The Nexus Prime spaceport possessed that particular brand of sterile magnificence that screamed it were better than you in 17 different languages, most of which involved clicking sounds that would give humans lockjaw. Crystalline spires stretched toward twin suns like the galaxy's most expensive middle fingers, while hover platforms glided between them in patterns so perfectly choreographed they made synchronized swimming look like a bar fight. Ambassador Hendricks, because of course the aliens couldn't pronounce her actual name and settled for something that sounded like clearing phlegm, stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately understood why the Galactic Consortium had chosen this particular world for their capital. Everything here whispered the same message. You are small, we are vast. Resistance is futile, please form an orderly queue for your subjugation. The welcoming committee consisted of 3 beings who looked like they'd been designed by a committee of particularly pretentious art students. The tallest resembled a praying mantis that had discovered both protein powder and an unfortunate addiction to geometric jewelry. Its companion appeared to be what happened when someone crossed a jellyfish with a filing cabinet, complete with translucent flesh that revealed organs arranged in what could charitably be called aesthetic patterns. The third delegate looked almost human, if humans were made of polished chrome, and had apparently never heard of the concept of humility. Representative species known as humans, the mantis creature announced, its voice carrying the particular tone reserved for discussing mildly interesting bacteria. You will accompany us to the ratification chamber. Hendricks nodded politely, her hands clasped behind her back in what the aliens undoubtedly interpreted as submissive posture. They had no way of knowing she was checking the small device sewn into her jacket's lining, a device that currently displayed a countdown timer showing approximately 6 hours remaining. The procession through Nexus Prime's corridors provided an excellent opportunity to admire the consortium's commitment to intimidation through interior design. Every surface gleamed with materials that cost more than most planets' annual budget. Holographic displays showed the vast extent of consortium territory, with Earth appearing as a barely visible speck in one corner, helpfully labeled as unincorporated territory, pending classification. Quaint, the chrome humanoid remarked as they walked, its voice carrying artificial warmth that fooled absolutely no one. But surely even your species can recognize the futility of opposing galactic civilization. Oh, we recognize quite a few things, Hendricks replied mildly, futility being just one of them. The jellyfish filing cabinet pulsed what might have been amusement. Such refreshing honesty. Most species require several demonstration bombardments before achieving such clarity. They passed through security checkpoints that scanned Hendricks with technology so advanced it probably knew her genetic code better than she did. The guards, creatures that looked like they'd been hired from the universe's most exclusive nightmare collection, found exactly what they expected. No weapons, no hidden technology, no miraculous escape devices. Just one ordinary human female, carrying nothing more dangerous than diplomatic credentials and what appeared to be a small locket containing someone's photograph. The ratification chamber itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as architecture. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, decorated with a holographic display of every species that had voluntarily joined the consortium. The human delegation area consisted of a single chair positioned at the center of a vast circular floor, surrounded by tiered seating that rose like the walls of a coliseum. Thousands of beings filled those seats, representatives from across the galaxy who had come to witness the formal capitulation of the last independent human settlements. Camera drones buzzed overhead like metallic insects, broadcasting the proceedings to every corner of consortiums. The terms are quite generous, the mantis being informed her as it took its position at the ceremonial podium. Complete cultural integration, mandatory education protocols for your younger specimens, and resource allocation rights that will ensure your species' continued existence under proper supervision. Hendricks took her assigned seat and examined the documents they'd provided. The translation software had done its best, but certain concepts required cultural context. What the consortium called voluntary relocation, humans might describe differently. What they termed genetic optimization programs sounded suspiciously like selective breeding, and their enhanced labor initiatives bore a striking resemblance to slavery, with better marketing. I notice there's no provision for maintaining human governmental structures, she observed. The chrome humanoid's expression managed to convey pity despite being entirely artificial. Primitive organizational systems are incompatible with galactic-level civilization. Your species will be much happier once properly integrated into our social framework. Around them, The assembled delegates murmured agreement in languages that ranged from melodious to sounds that suggested someone was torturing a broken synthesizer. The consensus was clear: humans were backward, humans were stubborn, and humans were about to learn their place in the galactic order. Hendricks nodded thoughtfully and reached for the ceremonial signing instrument, a device that looked like someone had crossed a pen with a small torture implement. "I do have one small request before we proceed." The mantis being's compound eyes glittered with what might have been satisfaction. "Of course. Final requests are traditional among newly incorporated species. I'd like to pay my respects to my ancestors. It's a human custom. We honor those who came before us during moments of great significance." The jellyfish cabinet pulsed with what the translation software identified as amusement. How wonderfully primitive. Ancestor worship among a spacefaring species. By all means, conduct your ritual. The galaxy should witness the charming superstitions we're helping you overcome. Hendricks smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since arriving. "Thank you for your understanding. I'll need to visit the city center for the ceremony. It requires direct contact with the ground." The chrome humanoid gestured magnanimously, a final indulgence for a dying culture. "How poetic. We'll provide an escort to ensure your safety among our citizens." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Hendricks glanced once more at the device hidden in her jacket. 5 hours and 37 minutes remained. She'd need approximately 20 minutes to reach the city center, another 10 for the escort to position themselves optimally. And then, well, then the galaxy would learn something new about human custom. The procession through Nexus Prime streets resembled a parade designed by someone with a PhD in public humiliation. Word had spread through the city's communication networks faster than gossip at a diplomatic reception, and beings emerged from their gleaming towers to witness the spectacle of a human engaging in primitive ancestor worship, before surrendering her species as independent. The escort consisted of 12 guards who looked like they'd been recruited from the universe's most exclusive collection of apex predators, each one radiating the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing they could vaporize small moons before lunch. They formed a loose perimeter around Hendricks as she walked, their weapons powered down in a display of magnanimous contempt that spoke volumes about how dangerous they considered one unarmed human. Citizens lined the pristine streets in ever-growing numbers. The Vorthak, a species resembling ambulatory crystals with delusions of grandeur, chimed their amusement in harmonies that sounded like wind chimes having an argument. The hegemony representatives, who looked like someone had given artistic sensibilities to a collection of geometric shapes, projected holographic commentary that floated above the crowd like the galaxy's most pretentious sports broadcast. "Observe the bipedal gait," one broadcaster noted with the kind of academic fascination typically reserved for studying particularly interesting mold. "Notice how the primitive neural pathways manifest in ritualistic behavior patterns when faced with species-level extinction." A cluster of Zephyrian merchants, beings who resembled extremely judgmental houseplants, swayed in unison while discussing the anthropological significance of watching a backward species engage in its final cultural death rattle. Their conversation carried across the square in chemical signals that the translation software rendered as variations on how quaint and thank goodness we're evolved. Hendricks walked through it all with the serene expression of someone attending a particularly boring lecture on municipal tax policy. She paused occasionally to examine the architecture, nodding appreciatively at details that had taken consortium engineers decades to perfect. The aliens interpreted this as the wonder of a primitive mind confronted with superior civilization. They had no way of knowing she was actually calculating blast radii and structural weak point. The city center of Nexus Prime represented the absolute pinnacle of consortium achievement, a vast plaza surrounded by government towers that scraped the sky like accusations against the universe's sense of proportion. At the center stood a monument to galactic unity that looked like someone had asked a committee of philosophers to design a sculpture while blindfolded and slightly drunk. "Here will suffice," Hendricks announced, stopping at the monument's base. The crowd that had gathered numbered in the tens of thousands now, with more arriving every moment. Hover platforms filled the air like metallic confetti, carrying VIPs who wanted prime viewing angles for the humans' final cultural performance. News drones buzzed overhead in formations that would have made military aviators weep with envy. The mantis being from the ratification chamber had joined the escort, its compound eyes glittering with the anticipation of someone about to witness something deliciously pathetic. "Please, proceed with your ceremony." The galaxy watches with great interest. Hendrix knelt at the monument's base, placing her hands flat against the polished stone surface. The crowd murmured approval at this display of submission, or what they assumed was submission. Several commentators noted the touching regression to pre-spaceflight behavioral patterns, and the poignant desperation of a species facing inevitable cultural extinction. The chrome humanoid stepped forward with a recording device. "For historical archives," it explained with artificial solemnity, "future generations should understand how gracefully humans accepted their integration into galactic civilization." As Hendrix closed her eyes and began what appeared to be a moment of silent prayer, the assembled aliens settled in to enjoy the show. Vendors began circulating through the crowd, selling refreshments and souvenirs. Someone started a betting pool on how long the ritual would last. The general consensus was that humans, being sentimental creatures, would probably drag this out for maximum dramatic effect. The irony was so thick you could have used it to armor a battleship. Here was the most advanced collection of species in the galaxy, beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel and conquered death itself, standing around like tourists watching a street performer while congratulating themselves on their cultural sophistication. What they couldn't see, what their sensors couldn't detect because they were designed to identify technology, not quantum biological interfaces, was the faint shimmer beginning to emanate from the human's hand. To their instruments, it registered as nothing more than minor electromagnetic fluctuations, possibly caused by emotional stress or primitive bioelectric responses. In the crowd, a Nexarian philosopher began composing what it considered profound observations about the nature of defeat and dignity. A collective drone started calculating the sociological impact of witnessing the taming of Earth's children. 3 different documentary crews positioned themselves for optimal emotional impact shots. The human remained motionless, apparently lost in whatever mystical nonsense her species called communion with the dead. Around her, the greatest military and technological powers in the galaxy waited with the patience of adults watching a child's tantrum, secure in their superiority, and utterly convinced of their safety. The timer hidden in Hendrix's jacket showed 30 seconds remaining. 20, 28. The crowd's chatter reached a crescendo as beings shared their theories about human psychology and the inevitable benefits of consortium guidance. Camera drones adjusted their angles for maximum dramatic effect. Street vendors reported record sales. 15 seconds. 10. 5. The human's lips moved in what appeared to be a final prayer, though the words were too quiet for the translation systems to capture. Later analysis would reveal she had whispered something in an ancient Earth language that roughly translated to, "Now you see us." 3, 2, 1. What happened next would be studied in xenosociology courses for the next 1,000 years, assuming there were any xenosociologists left to teach them. 10 seconds after the human fell to her knees, reality decided it had heard quite enough of the Galactic Consortium's nonsense. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the aliens' day came when every quantum sensor within 50 kilometers simultaneously had what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. Instruments that had reliably measured subatomic particles for millennia suddenly started displaying readings that suggested the fundamental constants of physics had decided to take an unscheduled vacation. The second sign was when the temperature in the plaza began climbing at a rate that made solar flares look like mild spring weather. Hendrix opened her eyes and smiled with the serene expression of someone who had just finished a particularly satisfying conversation with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Around her, the polished stone of the monument began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected sunshine and everything to do with the fact that several billion human souls had just been asked to contribute their stored solar energy to a rather important cause. "Fascinating readings," she remarked conversationally to the nearest scientist, a hegemony researcher, whose geometric form was currently flashing colors that indicated extreme confusion mixed with the dawning realization that perhaps they had made a small error in judgment. "Your sensors are detecting quantum entanglement on a scale that shouldn't be theoretically possible, aren't they?" The mantis being that had been so smugly confident mere moments earlier was now staring at its instruments with the expression of someone discovering their calculator had started doing philosophy instead of mathematics. The energy signatures, they're off every known scale. What did you— Oh, I didn't do anything particularly complex, Hendricks replied, rising gracefully to her feet, while the stone beneath her began to achieve temperatures normally associated with stellar cores. I simply activated a quantum entanglement network that's been building for the past 3 centuries. Every human who has ever died on any world in this galaxy just became a conduit for stored solar radiation. The crowd's murmur of amusement had transformed into something resembling the sound a beehive might make if someone informed the bees they were about to be extinct. Beings who had been taking souvenir photos moments earlier were now backing away with the universal recognition that they were witnessing something that would likely require extensive therapy to forget. You see, Hendricks continued in the tone of a teacher explaining basic arithmetic to particularly slow students. Humans have this curious habit of preparing for the worst possible scenario. When we first encountered your consortium's expansion policies, we realized that diplomacy might eventually prove insufficient. The chrome humanoid's artificial features managed to convey horror despite being completely synthetic. You're describing a doomsday weapon that uses the dead as power sources. That's impossible. The energy calculations alone would require the combined output of approximately 47 billion human lives across 1,700 different worlds. Hendricks interrupted helpfully. Yes, we did the math extensively. Turns out when you treat death as a battery storage system, rather than an ending, you can accumulate quite impressive amounts of stellar energy over time. By now the plaza's perfect architecture was beginning to show signs of stress that had nothing to do with poor construction, and everything to do with the fact that the ambient temperature was approaching levels typically found in the upper atmosphere of gas giants. The monument itself had begun to glow like a small sun, casting shadows that moved independently of any known light source. Emergency alarms began wailing across the city in frequencies that suggested panic had become the dominant emotion among Nexus Prime's population. Evacuation protocols activated with the desperate efficiency of beings who had suddenly realized they were standing on what amounted to a planetary-scale fusion bomb. "This is madness," the jellyfish filing cabinet declared, its translucent form pulsing with colors that indicated it was rapidly approaching the biological equivalent of a complete system crash. "You're destroying yourselves along with us." Hendricks examined her fingernails with the casual interest of someone discussing the weather. "Actually, no. You see, humans also developed some rather clever quantum shielding technology. I'm perfectly safe. You, on the other hand," she gestured at the rapidly superheating environment around them. "Well, let's just say your city's about to become a rather impressive glass sculpture." The guards who had been so casually confident in their superiority were now discovering that weapons designed to vaporize conventional matter worked about as well against quantum-entangled solar energy as throwing snowballs at a supernova. Their desperate attempts to neutralize the growing inferno only succeeded in making the light show more spectacular. "Stop this!" the mantis being shrieked, its compound eyes reflecting the growing inferno like a kaleidoscope of impending doom. "We can negotiate. Terms can be adjusted." "Oh, I'm sure they can," Hendricks agreed pleasantly. "Unfortunately, humans aren't particularly fond of negotiations that begin with terms like complete cultural integration and genetic optimization program. We prefer our diplomacy to be conducted between equals, not between masters and slaves." The city's crystalline spires, those magnificent monuments to consortium superiority, were beginning to warp and flow like candles in a blast furnace. The perfectly choreographed hover platforms fell from the sky as their pilots abandoned any pretense of maintaining traffic patterns in favor of the more urgent goal of not being vaporized. As the temperature continued its relentless climb toward levels that would make stellar physicists weep with professional envy, Hendricks walked calmly through the chaos with the measured pace of someone taking a pleasant evening stroll. Behind her, the greatest city in consortium space began its transformation from architectural marvel to geological feature. "The truly beautiful part," she called over the sound of reality having a complete breakdown, "is that this is happening simultaneously on every major consortium world."
Turns out when you spread human settlements across the galaxy as slave labor, you also distribute a very effective weapons network. The last thing the survivors would remember before the evacuation ships carried them away from what had once been their capital was the sight of a single human walking unharmed through an inferno that was rewriting the local laws of physics, humming what sounded suspiciously like an old Earth lullaby. What had once been the jewel of galactic civilization now resembled what would happen if someone asked a particularly vindictive god to redesign a city using only fusion plasma and righteous indignation. The crater that marked Nexus Prime's former location stretched for kilometers in every direction, its edges fused into crystalline formations that would have been breathtakingly beautiful if they hadn't been created by the systematic vaporization of several million sentient beings. Hendrix stood at the crater's rim, brushing imaginary dust from her diplomatic jacket while surveying her handiwork with the satisfied expression of someone who had just completed a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. The quantum shielding that protected her hummed with barely audible harmonics, creating a small bubble of survivable reality in what had become a landscape that violated several fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Her communication device chirped with incoming reports from across the galaxy, each message painting the same picture with variations in scale and artistic flair. The hegemony's primary administrative world had become a lake of molten metal that would cool into abstract sculptures over the next several millennia. The Vorthak crystal cities had achieved a state of quantum superposition that left them existing in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. The Nexarian philosophical centers had been transformed into libraries of pure energy that scholars would study for eons, assuming any scholars survived to do the studying. Status report, she said into the device, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone conducting a routine inventory check. Lazarus protocol completion across all primary targets. 97%, came the reply from what remained of Earth's government. Estimated consortium military capacity reduction. 94%. Surviving alien populations displaying unprecedented levels of cooperative behavior and sudden respect for human territorial boundaries. Casualties on our side, 0. The shielding protocols performed exactly as designed. Also, we're receiving approximately 4,000 surrender offers per minute from various consortium remnants. Apparently the phrase unconditional capitulation has become very popular in alien vocabulary. Hendrix nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose centuries-long contingency planning had paid off exactly as intended. Around the galaxy, the beings who had spent the morning congratulating themselves on their cultural superiority were now discovering that survival sometimes required adjusting one's perspective on the relative value of different species. A transport ship appeared on the horizon, its hull scarred from passage through the superheated atmosphere but otherwise intact. As it landed near the crater's edge, Hendrix reflected on the peculiar ironies of galactic politics. The consortium had built their empire on the assumption that technological advancement naturally correlated with moral authority. They had never considered that a species might develop the capability to crack planets, while maintaining enough restraint to only crack the ones that really truly deserved it. The ship's hatch opened to reveal Captain Osworth, Earth's most diplomatically experienced military officer and the only person in human space who could deliver apocalyptic damage reports while making them sound like weather updates. Impressive work, he observed, gesturing at the geological reformation that had once been a city, though I suspect the cleanup costs are going to be significant. Fortunately, that's not our problem anymore, Hendrix replied, boarding the ship with the casual air of someone finishing a successful business trip. The surviving consortium leadership seems remarkably eager to discuss reparations and territorial recognition. Amazing how quickly primitive species becomes valued galactic partners when you demonstrate appropriate negotiating leverage. As the transport lifted away from what geologists would eventually classify as the most perfectly spherical crater in recorded history, communication arrays across the galaxy carried a single message to every surviving alien civilization. The text was brief, polite, and contained the kind of diplomatic language that made previous territorial disputes seem like friendly disagreements about lawn maintenance. The human species wishes to inform the galactic community that Earth and all human settlements are now considered sovereign territory under the protection of the Lazarus Defense Network. Any future attempts at forced integration, cultural assimilation, or resource exploitation will be met with immediate and comprehensive response. We look forward to peaceful coexistence with all species who respect the principle of voluntary association. Please note that funeral arrangements for the former consortium leadership are unnecessary, as cremation has already been provided. The response was immediate and nearly universal. Alien governments that had spent centuries building elaborate military hierarchies suddenly discovered the virtues of pacifism. Species that had prided themselves on conquest found new appreciation for diplomacy. The phrase human space acquired the same respectful tone previously reserved for discussing natural disasters or incurable disease. On Earth, historians began the complex task of updating galactic political maps while philosophers debated whether the systematic vaporization of an entire imperial power structure constituted genocide or extremely aggressive urban renewal. The consensus seemed to be that it fell into the category of necessary renovations with extensive debris removal. In the Outer Rim territories, human colonies that had spent generations under alien occupation received visits from remarkably polite delegations, offering apologies, reparations, and sincere assurances that previous policies regarding human status had been based on regrettable misunderstanding. Somehow, every surviving alien species had simultaneously discovered that humans possessed remarkable intelligence, admirable cultural depth, and absolutely fascinating technological capabilities that definitely warranted respectful study rather than forcible integration. The galaxy had learned, with the efficiency that only comes from witnessing the comprehensive destruction of everything you previously considered permanent, that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their numbers or their stubborn refusal to accept defeat. It was their patience. They had spent 3 centuries allowing themselves to be scattered across alien worlds, accepting positions as laborers and servants and expendable colonists. They had endured condescension and mockery and casual brutality while building something that no consortium strategist had been able to detect because it was hidden in plain sight. A network of willing martyrs, whose deaths became power sources for a weapon that could rewrite the political structure of an entire galaxy.
Transformation into the galaxy's newest tourist attraction. Future visitors would stand at its rim and contemplate the philosophical implications of a civilization that had been so certain of its superiority that it never noticed its slaves were preparing its funeral pyre. The universe, as it turned out, had a rather dark sense of humor about the dangers of underestimating species that preferred their diplomatic negotiations to be conducted between equals rather than between masters and the soon-to-be extinct